Good day, everybody. Zack here, and welcome to another episode of Daily Rider, where we learn about motorcycles as we ride. Our guest today is the Suzuki DR-Z4S. That is a quintessential dual sport motorcycle. It has long travel suspension, tall seat, a small gas tank, and a 400cc single cylinder engine. Pretty basic concept. Dual sport motorcycles have been around for a long time, and they're a great compromise of capability for those people. Whoa, hang on. The DR-Z4S has an MSRP of $9,000, maybe you've heard. And if that seems a little high to you, you're not alone. The DR-Z4 is updated significantly over the outgoing DR-Z400, but not entirely. And I think the looming question is whether or not the DR-Z4 represents a modern enough interpretation of a dual sport motorcycle to justify the price. So that's what we're going to talk about on the ride to work today, and maybe we'll even mess around with that supermoto bike if you stick around long enough. Here we go, everybody. Alrighty, before we get going on this DR-Z4S Daily Rider, a quick reminder that this video is brought to you by RevZilla. RevZilla is the YouTube channel that you're watching and also an e-commerce company, meaning we sell stuff for motorcycles and for motorcycle people. So if you have a dual sport and you want new tires or handguards or soft luggage for it, you can find it at RevZilla.com. If you want a new helmet, jacket, gloves, boots, whatever for yourself, you can also find that at RevZilla.com. And when you spend your money at RevZilla, a little bit of that money goes into making programming like this, Daily Rider, as well as the shop manual with Harry Henning, the High Side, Low Side podcast, and CTXP Adventures. That's all we really want you to know. Appreciate you joining us as always. Hope you have fun. All right, everybody. Where do we start? The engine. We always start with the engine. This is a 398cc liquid-cooled single-cylinder engine. It's what some people might call a thumper. It is practically not very much different than the outgoing DR-Z400, but technically it is quite a bit different. Actually, I think the connecting rod and the piston and the crankshaft are the same, but everything else is different. There are new valves, new cylinder head, new cases, new almost everything. The highlights, I would say, are the fact that there's now fuel injection because the DR-Z400 was, of course, carbureted, and that has led to the new mill in this DR-Z4S being quite a bit more efficient, to the tune of 90% fewer hydrocarbons being released from this engine. So that was a big impetus for Suzuki updating this, was to be able to sell it on the global market again, because it did not follow emissions regulations for many parts of the world outside of North America, and Suzuki has succeeded in doing that. One last little note there is this big bulge in the pipe here, which is where one of the catalytic converters, the only catalytic converter in the North American market. I believe there's another catalytic converter that goes in the muffler for European and other global markets. But you can see the pipe looks quite a bit more modern and slightly different than the outgoing DR-Z400. It's quite a bit more complex. There are more welds because it has to hold more stuff inside it. Okie doke. On to the chassis. It is still a steel frame, but instead of being a single backbone with a piece of framework that goes over the top of the engine, it is sort of a twin spar style. So it's split like this if you look at it from above, and it has a spar on each side that reaches out and grabs the engine. So slightly different design than the outgoing frame. It has an aluminum subframe that bolts on, which is nice for any bike like this, especially if you chuck it off a cliff by accident or something like that and you bend the subframe, you can replace that piece and not total the motorcycle. It's fully adjustable suspension except for preload in the fork, I believe. You can do compression, rebound, damping up here, and fully adjustable shock if memory serves. And aside from that, the chassis updates I'd like to talk about have to do with ergonomics. The seat is 0.6 inches lower and also wider. The foot pegs are about an inch farther back. The handlebar is about an inch high, a little more than an inch higher than the outgoing DR-Z400. And of course, there's a whole raft of styling updates. It's got a little more modern, aggressive. It's got LED lighting, completely different headlight assembly and all that jazz. And the upshot for all of this is it holds about a third of a gallon less gas on board. It weighs about 16 pounds more, and it makes the same amount of power. Now, that is the pessimistic view. As I said, Suzuki went through a lot of work to try to make this bike legal to sell everywhere in the world. And the bottom line is that it's hard to do that. They maintained the amount of power that the old bike put out, but did not increase it because there are so many more regulations on particulate emissions and noise emissions that has kept the DR-Z4 in the same performance stratum as the outgoing 400. If you're interested in a deeper dive in specs than that, I should point out right now that I did write an article about this bike after riding it through the Tillamook State Forest in Oregon. That article lives on Common Tread at RevZilla.com, and the link for that article is in the description of this video if you'd like to learn more about the technical updates and see some CAD drawings of the engine, stuff like that. And if you want to do that later, that's okay too. We can just get to riding to work now. Like I said, quintessential dual sport motorcycle. We've got just about a foot of suspension travel, 11 point something inches of suspension travel. We've got a big tall seat, 21-inch front wheel, 18-inch rear, some quasi knobby kind of sort of tires, but also headlight, taillight blinkers, 4-way blinker switch, and some electronic options, which we will get into. Here's the little 2-color LCD dash, and here is the single touch starter button that Suzuki is pretty proud of. There you have it, a thumperoodle. I like the bright Suzuki yellow. I like the new bodywork. I even like the little Cyclops eye that it's got here. All right, let's ride to work, shall we? Dual sport it. All right, rolling along here, we can talk about specs. I mentioned the tall seat height. That is 36.2 inches to be specific, and that is quite tall, which as we get to this red light, hopefully I can experiment with. 36.2 inch seat height means I can barely flat foot at 6'2". So it's quite a tall motorcycle. Of course, on the Daily Rider scales with a full 2.3 gallons of gas in the tank, it weighed in at 331 pounds, which is 75 or 100 pounds lighter than many, many motorcycles on the road. As we accelerate away from this green light, I will tell you that Suzuki's claimed horsepower is 38 horsepower. That is not a ton of power. But we'll talk more about how the engine works later. I don't think the number should scare you off whether you feel it's high or low. And of course, I made note of the $8,999 MSRP, which raised eyebrows around the motorcycling world when Suzuki announced that pricing. As for what it feels like to sit on, the seat is wider and lower than the outgoing bike, maybe, but it's still, in the world of motorcycling, feels like quite a tall and narrow seat. It is a pretty compact riding position. Dual sports have often pretty tall foot pegs because you want lots of ground clearance down there, of course. There's not a ton of legroom. There's enough, but not a ton. And the handlebars rolled back are pretty close to the cockpit depending on where you sit in the seat. And so it's, yeah, surprisingly compact riding position considering it's a tall drink of water, if you will. All right, and now we are merging onto the freeway. So it's not very free currently, but this is nevertheless a place where, you know, dirt bikes, to use a broad term, typically struggle, right? Because of the narrow seat that is not very comfortable, because of the tall spindly suspension, because of the very knobby tires, and it often gives you sort of like a flighty feeling in the handling and a little bit of an exposed feeling as a rider. A lot of vibrations from the engine because they're not meant to just like spin at many thousands of RPM for long periods of time. But the DR-Z4S is, like I said, a quintessential dual sport, and what that means is that it's pretty good at this kind of thing, or at least it was designed with this in mind. Now, it is not a hugely comfortable motorcycle on the freeway. I'm not going to lie about that. There's no wind protection, and perhaps most famously with this update to the DR-Z4S, there is no sixth gear. Suzuki chose not to give the DR-Z4S a sixth gear, despite the DR-Z400 being a famously capable and well-loved motorcycle in the two-wheel world and having 5 gears, and everyone saying, man, when they update the DR-Z400 and they give it a 6-speed, that's going to be the day. Well, we all need to wait a little longer for that day, unfortunately. What I will say in Suzuki's defense is that it's pretty good at this kind of thing. From the position of the rider, I don't have a lot of complaints. There are some vibes in the handlebar, there are vibes in the seat for sure. The vibes in the foot peg are not so bad because the rubber inserts are still in there. but it feels totally fine at 65, 70 miles an hour. In fact, let's go 75, or almost 80 now. And the vibrations really aren't that bad, I don't think. I mean, considering you're on what's basically a dirt bike with a 400cc single, it's not oppressive. But I will say that as a person who loves motorcycles and has been around them my whole life, I do feel like I have some amount of mechanical sympathy, and it just feels a little strained. You can just feel how fast the engine is spinning, and I keep thinking, man, I wish I could upshift. So all of that is to say, it should have a 6th gear, is my opinion. There's just no way around that. But it actually works pretty well in these situations, and I have to credit Suzuki with the fact that if you want to just go down the highway at 70 or 75 miles an hour, it's gonna do it, and it's not gonna complain much anyway. Another little bit of praise I need to heap on the DR-Z4 is fuel mileage, which you see I'm looking at live fuel mileage right now, and you're seeing, what are we seeing, 63, we're seeing 65. We're gonna go up this hill, which is gonna knock us down a peg or two here. But my fuel mileage figures were in the mid 60s, high 60s, and that was riding it on the freeway a bit and surface streets a bit. And you know, obviously if you're riding first gear muddy trails all day long, you're not gonna get 70 miles to the gallon. But as a street bike, it is surprisingly efficient, and it means that that 2.5 gallons, 2.3 is what I said, it's gonna take you 150 miles, which isn't bad for a dirt bike, I don't think. If you are going to use it mostly as a street bike, whether it's this bike or the SM, I would probably gear it up a little bit. I'd probably go down a couple teeth in the rear sprocket just to give it a little bit of legs on the highway. I will point out that the DR-Z4S I think is actually slightly better than the SM, because the SM has those smaller wheels, which reduces gearing just a little bit. So oddly, I think the S is actually geared more appropriately for the street than the SM is, which is kind of unfortunate. But anyway, what about the mirrors, Zach? Mirrors are fine. They're pretty good, actually. I mean, they're surprisingly smooth and sturdy and well built, and I think they're in a good position and stuff like that. Dual sport mirrors are tricky because you're always scooting forward and back. Like if you got your crotch way up on the tank like you're supposed to be riding, then you got to readjust the mirrors. And if you scoot back to sit in a more natural, normal position maybe, then you need to readjust them again. But yeah, that's already too much to talk about the mirrors. They're fine. All right, off we go into our neighborhood round town challenge. Now the goal here is to come to a complete stop 0 miles per hour on the speedo without putting your feet down. Kind of a fun test of a motorcycle's poise at low speed. Now a dual sport motorcycle, that was a pretty good one. Dual sport motorcycle should be good at this thing for a few reasons, not least of which you're riding it in the woods or something, right? Should be good at low speed. But also round town, if you're not blessed with a long inseam, it's nice to not tip over randomly because this bike is fairly tall. Also, dual sports are pretty light, which means you can sort of adjust the attitude of the bike a little bit with, wow, oh, I stalled it and see I almost tipped over. This person's yielding to me, that was nice of them. Little do they know it's my first day. The bottom line is the DR-Z4S is pretty darn good around town and pretty good at the stop sign challenge because it is light and agile. It is quite tall, so when you do have to put your foot down, it's a long way down, but you know, no big surprise that the dirt bike's good at low speed, right? Right. I also think in general the fueling is pretty good. I think the clutch feel is quite nice. It's linear and easy to learn. It's not strenuous experience at all, which is as it should be. Whoa, that was a really good one. Excellent. All right, as we pull up to this stop light, I don't think this is a bad time to talk about the dash actually, which is a little two-color situation. As I pointed out, fuel gauge at the top, speedo nice and big in the middle, gear position indicator in the upper left, clock upper right. Pretty basic. I was looking at miles per gallon instant here. This little up, down, and mode switch here, you can toggle through the different options for you know, the trip meters and average fuel per trip, battery voltage for some reason, odometer, and that is just about it. There are also 3 ride modes. If you tap this mode button here, you'll see this little box illuminate up there, and if I go up or down, I can go to either A, B, or C ride modes. I can also choose traction control 2, traction control 1, TC off, or TCG for gangsta. No, actually for gravel. Basic thing there is traction control 2 is the most conservative, then 1 you can shut it off, which is great. There's also the G mode, which offers quite a bit of slip, you know, it's for riding in the dirt, not surprisingly. So it offers some traction control, but it will also allow a lot of wheel spin before it intervenes. In my experience testing in the dirt, it's actually quite good. I think it's calibrated quite nicely for what it's supposed to do. All right, as we approach our final stop sign for the challenge here. Alley-oop. Oh yeah, nice one. I'll say that the DR-Z4S, I believe, is great around town. Really good. Dual sport bikes are great in an urban environment. I'm not the first person to say that, nor the last. The thing you have to be able to tolerate or live with is the tall seat height and the relatively uncomfortable ergonomics for considering what you're doing with the bike. You do benefit a lot from the long travel suspension, from the big front wheel when you hit potholes and such. But there are some downsides too. In general though, good round town bike. Here we are in Lover's Lane. We can talk about passenger accommodations. Not particularly plush back there, as you can imagine. Where's the little, yeah, these tiny little aluminum foot pegs that swing out there. It is not for cross-country travel, certainly, passenger accommodations. But you know, I like to think there'll be quite a few first dates on a DR-Z4 over the years. You know, it's the kind of bike that you buy maybe when you're getting into motorcycling or something. It's a typical bike for people to buy early in their motorcycling career, and I like the idea of a partner getting on the back and for going to bop around town, get some soft serve, perhaps some tacos, and I think it'll be just fine for that. All right, here we are in the Twisty Road section, and you might say this isn't what the DR-Z is made for, but of course it kind of is, because the whole point of a dual sport is that you ride roads like this out to your favorite trail and then ride the trails and then ride home. It's adventure light, right? Having ridden quite a bit of pavement on this bike and country roads, I think that it's a surprisingly good street bike. It is not on the same level as an actual street bike, but what it does do is really show how bad real enduro bikes are. I'm talking basically just sort of competition bikes with license plates on them, but they're very severe and the seats are even more uncomfortable and the ergonomics are even worse, and perhaps the tires are more often more aggressive. And when you ride a bike like this, if you've ridden bikes like those, you're sort of like, oh, it actually can be a lot nicer. Now obviously this bike is not, when it comes to riding single track trails or that kind of thing, even close to a KTM 350 EXC or something like that. It's not in the same performance level. But when you're tearing it down as a dirt bike that's too heavy or doesn't have the same kind of off-road performance, remember that there is something gained, and it's right here. Some of you might be yelling at your screens saying, just talk about the supermoto one. Why are you riding the dirt bike on the twisty pavement? I want to know about the supermoto bike. Well, I've hinted at the supermoto bike and we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but since we are here, I will say that if you want this style of bike, but you just want 17-inch wheels, you want street tires, you want a bigger front brake disc, for example, you can get that in the form of that DR-Z4 SM, which is largely the same motorcycle, but in a situation like that, going down twisty roads, you're going to have much more direct feel. You're going to have slightly less suspension travel, which will mean lower seat height and just a little bit more connection to the road. It's not an outright true sport bike, but it does offer the sort of like charm and appeal of a long suspension dirt bike with grip and agility of a light street bike. My big takeaway though is how surprisingly kind of planted and enjoyable this bike is, as long as you don't expect it to be a sport bike. It's really fun. All right, let's hoss on it, shall we? See what 38 horsepower will do for us. All right, here we go. All right, we got a red light. We can talk about brakes. Let's jump on those binders, see if we can get the Hear the front tire. Brakes are fine. Dirt bike brakes. It's a 270 mil single rotor up there. It's meant to have enough power for the street, but really be appropriate for the dirt, and that is what it is. On the topic of brakes, you can shut off ABS. So you can hold down this button here when you are stopped, and you will see ABS rear illuminate there. And that obviously means no rear ABS. And if you hold down again, the rear will disappear and they'll just say no ABS, which means front and rear ABS has been disabled, which I'm going to not do that. We'll leave rear off. Oh, here we go. Like the TC light flashing in third gear is just like it blows my mind. Well, we never catch this green light. It's a good thing. We already talked about the dash, and we can just jump right into our conversation about engines. And it's a kind of interesting one, I think, because it's an easy thing to say, well, I'd never buy a DR-Z4 just for the engine. Like, it's not a special engine, it's a friggin' 400cc single. How excited do you want me to get about that? Well, here's what I'll say. I think it's kind of a standout in this category, actually, because it's so measured and linear and easy to use, and it kind of doesn't overpromise. And because of that, I think it over-delivers a little bit. Like, it's easy to look at a KTM 390 engine and be like, oh, it makes 44 claimed horsepower and this makes 38, so the KTM is just better, it just makes more power, it's better. But I don't think it is. I think I much prefer this engine. It's got good torque on tap, it's got reasonable amounts of power practically everywhere in the rev range. It's not showy or interesting. It's very practical. It's very Suzuki. And maybe you're after pure excitement, and if that's what you want, then this engine and maybe even this bike or this platform or whatever might not be entirely for you. But as it pertains to mid-size single-cylinder engines, I think this one does everything it's supposed to, and that's kind of more than you can say for most of the competition, I think. All right, so we're coming to the end of the ride here. We can circle back to that initial question of, has the DR-Z become new and modern and high-tech enough to justify a $9,000 price? You know, there were some good arguments being made in my Instagram post about this bike. In the comment section, there's some people saying, you know, everything's gotten more expensive, so why shouldn't this? And other people saying, that's an absurd amount of money to charge for a dual sport bike, you know, and you can get a Suzuki GSX-8S for this money, right? Or maybe even a little less, whatever. The dash and the switchgear is the bike in a microcosm, I think. It's so interesting, right? Like, think about this dash and switchgear on a $9,000 street bike. You'd be appalled, right? You'd be like, oh, come on, a $5,000, $6,000 KTM's got a 5-inch TFT and all this gizmos and whatnot. But then if you think about an $11,000 or $12,000 or even $13,000 dual sport or enduro bike, this is a luxurious dash with lots of options, like good accessibility to ride modes and a nice big screen and stuff like that. So it's living in this weird space, this bike, where it feels like it's kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Not unlike the original dual sport paradox of, you know, do you make it a comfortable street bike or do you make it a good dirt bike? Where do you draw the line? For each person, it's going to be totally different. And I have to say that the more I look at this bike, its design, and where it sits in the market, the more I feel like I understand where Suzuki was coming from, what they were aiming for as a whole in the market. We'll talk more about bike comparisons a little later on, but I think there's a solid argument to be made that the DR-Z4S is quote-unquote worth it. I think it checks a lot of boxes. Now, our dirt test on this dual sport machine will be too short for this bike because this is where it sort of wants to live. I'm trying to think what we should do with the controls here. So I don't really care about the different ride modes. You can put it in A for aggressive, B for basic, and C for comfort. And I liked the C mode for riding off-road, but I don't know. Well, let's just try it in the mode I was in here. We're going to go ABS off in the rear. TC1, which, you know, allows you to accelerate. I guess it's maybe like, yeah, it's approximately street bike throttle mapping or whatever. TC off, we all know how that works. But let's try that gravel mode. So actually I was kind of impressed with, as I said. So here we go. gravel mode, I'm going to do a couple little, I don't know, little donuts or something here. And you can see, like, gravel, wow, a big burnout, big peel out there. You know, allows you to lock up the back tire. It's actually really nicely set up to let you slide, let you spin the tire, but not completely lose it, which is admirable, I think. It's a good dirt bike. It really is solid. Not high performance, but really good. Now, if you wanted something slightly more road orientated, obviously, you might want something like its brother, the DR-Z4SM. Here it is, as I promised. 17-inch wheels, slightly shorter suspension, and that's just about it. There are a couple little quirks in the electronics we'll talk about in just a moment. The big thing, the wheels and this big 310 millimeter front brake. Of course, the lower suspension and smaller wheels means a lower seat height, but let's take it for a spin, shall we? And what do you know? It's in A for aggressive. Traction control is off. It's all ready to hoon around. Now, you'd probably really expect a 40 horsepower dirt bike with street wheels to do good wheelies, right? Is that what you'd expect? Well, good. That's what you should expect, because it does incredible wheelies. Dynamite wheelie bike. And of course, on board the SM, you do feel quite a bit more connected to the pavement. As I said, the brake is sharper and stronger. The seat height is lower, so when you approach a stoplight, it's not quite as big a reach. I don't remember what the actual seat height is as it compares to 36.2 inches. Might have to put that on screen right now. But yeah, this is what you'd probably expect a dirt bike with street tires to feel like. It feels narrow and small, but there's a crap ton more grip. One thing I should call out is that you can turn off rear ABS, as I've just done, but you cannot shut off ABS outright, which means the front ABS needs to stay on. And some people are disappointed with that. I kind of see where Suzuki's coming from, I guess. But of course, in our case, in the case of the daily rider testing routine, all we really need is for the rear ABS to be shut off. But not being able to shut off ABS altogether does harsh your stoppie groove just a little bit, though you can get little stoppies if you work at it. For those who want pure, unfettered supermoto action, you might be a little disappointed that you can't shut off the front ABS and get a true stoppie machine. There are, of course, ways around that, as we all know. But more importantly, is the ability to have a little bit of fun, drag the rear brake as you enter a corner of your choosing, and the DR-Z4SM delivers there for sure. It even squeals just to make us feel a little better about ourselves, the rear tire. Dunlop Q5 rubber, incidentally, which is nice, high quality rubber. Okay, as for the U-turn test, doesn't look like we have quite enough parking spaces in our lot, but yeah, no, I'm not going to do one parking space. That's never going to happen. But we'll line up here on this line. We will go full lock left, feet up. I mean, that's what, 1.5 parking spaces. You'd expect a dirt bike to be good, and it is. And wouldn't you know it, there's our friend, the old DR-Z4S, waiting for us. We can talk about these bikes as a whole, as a product line, because they are ultimately very, very, very similar. Let's take one more listen to the engine, shall we? Not terribly interesting, I wouldn't say. But like I said, the engine is, you know, quite utilitarian, quite useful, quite good, I think, when you really look at objectively what it's supposed to deliver, what it's supposed to do. And of course, just like the DR-Z400 that came before it, the aftermarket is going to be full of options for these bikes. I think that's going to be a good thing. Okay, enough of what I have to say. I want to hear what you have to say as usual. We're going to dive into some Instagram questions here. The first one is from Coyote Vigilant, who says, "Who is this for? Looks like a motocross bike with a headlight." And this is an interesting comment, I think, because anyone who knows what a DR-Z400 is will know that it's not a motocross bike. It's a much more tame version of motorcycling than that. But this is the thing that happens with a restyle sometimes, is that it looks aggressive. To the untrained eye, it looks sharp at the back, sharp at the front. It has a headlight and blinkers and stuff like that, but it does look more aggressive in a way that could fool people into thinking that it's a really, really aggressive dirt bike when it's not. It's supposed to be accommodating and versatile and stuff like that. So I think that's an interesting comment. I'm not sure if you're being facetious or not, but nevertheless, I do think it's a double-edged sword of updating the styling for the DR-Z4S when it does have a reputation that is pretty widespread in motorcycling, but it's not complete in motorcycling. Like, there are lots of people that might be fooled by the aggressive styling. All right, so how about some comparisons to other bikes in the class? This comes in from Matt Susi, who says, "Is this closer to a Honda CRF 450 Dual Sport or a CRF 300? And this is kind of what I was talking about, right? Like, when you see where Suzuki aimed this bike, the Honda lineup is a good example. You can get a CRF 300 that has 20-something horsepower and weighs basically the same amount as this bike does, and the suspension is not as good and not as adjustable, I think, and it doesn't have the same suite of electronics, and maybe you don't care about the suite of electronics, but the point is this is a more capable bike, certainly. And if you go up a step in Honda's lineup to the CRF 450 RL, I think it is RX, RL, they changed the name a few times, the plated enduro dual sport bike with a 450 engine in it that Honda has, that bike, I think you're supposed to change the oil every 600 miles or something like that, and valve checks might be measured in hours, I'm not sure. It's a very aggressive bike, and it's going to be high maintenance from a maintenance perspective, and it's going to be high maintenance to ride. You need to be an aggressive, capable rider to use that bike and use it well. So in a lot of ways, this DR-Z is in the middle, and I gotta say, I think it makes a lot of sense. Next question comes in from Jörg Schmersch, who says, "Why would I get this when the KTM Supermoto / Enduro are like $2,500 less? Is it that much better off-road?" So this is in reference to the KTM 390 Enduro and 390 SMC-R, which would be, sort of like comparison here. So is the DR-Z4S really that much better a dirt bike than the 390 Enduro? I have not ridden the 390 Enduro. I've ridden the 390 Adventure R here on Daily Rider. My colleague here at RevZilla has ridden the 390 Enduro, and he said it's basically what a lot of people expected, which is that it is a street bike engine that has been adapted into a sort of off-road-ish chassis with some long travel suspension, but it is, if anything, more street bike than the DR-Z4, which is already a dirt bike that leans pretty far to the street. So yes, popular opinion is that the DR-Z4 is a much better dirt bike. Is it better to the tune of thousands of dollars? Well, that's not up to me. That's up to you. There are some cultural and financial and economic winds blowing here, right? Like KTM, as of the publishing of this video, has not been on super stable ground organizationally, financially in the past 24 to 36 months. You have to think that some aggressive pricing is a part of the strategy with KTM to get people on their bikes. And Suzuki is, on the other hand, leaning on a great reputation in many ways, not least of which the previous generation of this bike, which was loved by many, many people. So like I said, whether or not it's worth it is not up to me, that's up to you. But I do think there's some context around there. Hopefully that helps. Next question comes in from Zeitundergudbirian. This is to do with the SM. The question is, does the SM make sense if I almost never take it off-road, or is a Yamaha MT-07, something like that, just more rowdy with better street chops? This is a good question. This is astute, right? And this is the reason that supermotos are a fringe enthusiasm in the world of motorcycling, right? I don't know what the actual numbers are for how many more DR-Z4Ss or DR-Z400Ss the Suzuki sells than supermoto version, but it's a lot. And this is part of the reason, right? Especially with this price hike. When you buy a DR-Z4 SM, you're getting a street bike that's very pointed and kind of aggressive in a certain way. And it looks cool and it's different, and that is great. But if you are never going to use the long travel suspension and you don't want the tall seat height, or it doesn't sort of offer a really bright facet of motorcycling to you that other bikes don't, then it is really hard to argue against a little naked bike like a Yamaha MT-07 or something, because ultimately MT-07 is going to be a better street bike overall as a street experience. If you really want the things that this bike does well, then it offers something to you. This is a great comment and an important thing to remember for anyone who's, cross-shopping between something really kind of siloed and specific like this and something more general. Okay, a couple more questions. Bear with me here. This one comes in from Yatri. I kind of like this question. Do we really need 6 gears on a dual sport? There was a lot of comments back and forth on my Instagram feed about this. People saying, no, you don't, because bikes have had 5 gears for many years and in the past, and it was fine. Why is everyone so worried about it? And lots of other people saying, no, come on, are you kidding me? You have to have 6 gears. And if you're going to have 6 gears, a dual sport's a perfect example, because you want first gear and maybe even second gear to be quite low so that when you're picking your way through a rock garden or hopping over roots or through a stream and you're off-road, then you have appropriate gearing. And then when you get on the highway, you have 5th and a 6th gear that's a nice overdrive. So this is the time when you do want as many gears as possible is in a dual sport. And I think ultimately, everyone's right. Should this bike have a 6th gear? Yes, it really should. And I can't believe that Suzuki chose to build in software like ride modes and different levels of traction control. Even if that's easier and cheaper, I get it, fine. But the optics of the priorities are so odd there when this bike just could really use a 6th gear. If you hold my feet to the fire and you say, Zach, does this bike need a 6th gear to do what this bike can do? No, you don't. It works as is. Last question here comes in from Yoon McD. We're gonna go with that. What do you think the redesign of this version will include 25 years from now? So this is a reference to the fact that the DR-Z400 came out in the year 2000 and this new DR-Z4S came out in 2025, a 25-year spread. That has to do with a lot of stuff I talked about in the beginning with all the upgrades to the engine and emissions and blah, blah, blah. Possible that the future involves even stricter emissions regulations, even more of a clampdown on recreational machines like this that are seen as superfluous and unnecessary in the world, and so the screws are turned extra tight. And what that could create, I suppose, theoretically, is a groundswell in interest and technological advancements and such for small and mid-sized motorcycles that are practical and versatile. So what might this bike turn into? I'm not sure if it would ever make sense to make it into something more complicated than what it is. But I suppose in 25 years, I see this bike being only a small evolution of itself as it stands. Like I could see trickle down technology for cruise control or something like that coming to a bike like this because people are for some reason abandoning huge, powerful, extreme motorcycles and leaning more toward bikes like this. Maybe it's even a situation where Suzuki puts a twin cylinder engine in this kind of thing, like outsourced parallel twin with 1-cylinder head, all pretty simple, like more valves, more pistons, sure, but a fairly simple engine, but you get approximately the same size and capability of motorcycle. I don't know, does Suzuki sell enough bikes in this platform, in this sort of zone of motorcycling to ever make that make sense? I don't know. I'm looking into 25 years from now, I got no idea what's going on. I think that's a super fun question though, and it was among many super fun questions that were asked of me. I appreciate you all chiming in. For now, let's get these suckers, especially this yellow sucker, on the Daily Rider leaderboard, and I can let you get on with the rest of your day. All right, stick around for just a sec here.
Hey everybody, all right, here we are inside RevZilla West at the Daily Rider leaderboard with a DR-Z4S ready to go. As a reminder of what's at the top of the board here, you got your Honda CB750 Hornet with the smiley face, you got a Triumph Tiger Sport 800, and the CF Moto Ibex 450 adventure bike. No other dual sports on the board as of now, I don't think. Am I forgetting something? Himalayan 450, 390 Adventure R from KTM. Those are small adventure bikes. So that means to some extent the DR-Z4S will stand alone. And I think in pointing out the Royal Enfield Himalayan 450 and KTM 390 Adventure R, this is kind of the area where I think the DR-Z4 is going to fall, right? It's pretty hard, I think, to argue that these bikes aren't more versatile. I mean, I've ridden the DR-Z4S in a lot of different scenarios. I've single track trails and water crossings and down 2-lane country roads and then down 4-lane freeways. These bikes will do all that, but ultimately these are much better all-round motorcycles and they do have some off-road capability. So this is where it gets a little fuzzy with the rankings, right? It's kind of tricky. I'm gonna pick up the magnet and we're gonna talk about where this sucker might fall. I think the DR-Z4S is a small gun to a gunfight, meaning you really have to kind of know what you're doing and know what you want for the DR-Z4S to make sense. And I think my ranking here is gonna be pretty predictable. Am I gonna go above the KTM or below the KTM? I'm gonna go below the KTM. I just think, and I hate to bring it back to price because it doesn't matter all that much, and perhaps you have the financial situation that leads you to believe that the Suzuki is the right bike for you. I just think dollar for dollar, pound for pound, if a small adventure bike is somewhat capable off-road, you can get away with a lot, and you have really good road manners. This is one of the things that the DR-Z4S is struggling with, is that historically, say the year 2000 when the DR-Z400 came out, motorcycling was a much different place. There just wasn't all the texture and sort of like all the options that we have now in the small and mid-size category. I do think that while people will complain all day long on the internet about the DR-Z4S costing $9,000 and only having 5 gears, and they're so offended by that, I think Suzuki's gonna sell a lot of them. And I think the reason is that the reputation is good and the bike itself is really, really capable and good and is gonna deliver a lot of people to a lot of smiles. And I hope you're one of those people. If not, I hope you learned something and I hope you had fun this episode of Daily Rider, and I, of course, will see you next time. See you, everybody.